Good evening. Her Excellency Professor Marie Bashir, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the official launch of the symposium entitled Spirited Voices from the Muslim World, Islam, Democracy, and Gender Rights. My name is Lily Rahim. I'm from the Department of Government and International Relations at this university, and I'll be chairing this evening's symposium launch. Before we proceed with the official launch, I would like to acknowledge that this symposium is taking place on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. Allow me to say a few words about the symposium and the main themes that we will be focusing on in the 3 days. Now, we've set ourselves quite a challenging task of examining the myriad interpretations of Islam, the different faces of Islam, and the complex challenges Muslims face in adapting and applying their faith in this increasingly interconnected and globalized environment. So many of the papers examine this global Muslim yearning for a political paradigm that is sensitive to their religious aspirations, but which also promotes democratic governance based on the principles of popular sovereignty, social justice, and dignity. This yearning is very much integral to the popular protest movements currently sweeping the Middle East, commonly referred to as the Arab uprising or the Arab Spring. This uprising is challenging outmoded modes of authoritarian governance, as well as the conventional or more orthodox ways of thinking about Islam. More specifically, it is charting a relatively new political course, a Muslim democracy that recognizes religion as a frame of reference, but also incorporates the sacred within the framework of the secular. And in the various sessions this morning and afternoon, these were some of the issues that the presenters discussed. This incipient Muslim democracy resonates with the universal principles of shura, or consultation and consensus, wasatiyah, or moderation, the middle path, adil, or justice, maslaha, or the common good. And as I noted earlier, these are the key themes of this symposium. The symposium also focuses on the work of reformist Muslim intellectuals and movements who are courageously reconciling Islam with the principles of democratic governance, pluralism, and a form of inclusive secularism. This reformist discourse resonates with the aspirations of the Muslim Ummah, or the global Muslim community, who yearn, as I noted earlier, for a democratic, a bottom-up, democratic and indigenously driven political system and society based on this spirit. And I emphasize this point, and I've already noted it earlier, the spirit of universal humanism and justice. And I am delighted and honored that many of the participants in this symposium include Muslim reformists who are actively engaged in reimagining and rebuilding the Ummah within the context of the Islamic Reformation. I'm also delighted and deeply honored that Her Excellency Professor Marie Bashir has taken time out of her very busy schedule this Easter break to officially launch the symposium. So ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, please join me in welcoming Her Excellency Professor Marie Bashir.
Thank you, Professor Lily Rahim. Thank you for those warm words of welcome and your very insightful introduction to this evening's symposium. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and I do so tonight as Chancellor of this university, as Governor of New South Wales, and in the absence of the Governor-General as Administrator of the Government of the Commonwealth of Australia. So wearing all of those hats, it almost sounds a little like, dare I say, Gilbert and Sullivan. But it is a great pleasure to be with you all, to extend the warmest of welcomes on behalf of the university, this wonderful university, the oldest in Australia, and the one which taught me medicine, from which I graduated over 55 years ago in medicine, and also on behalf of Sydney, the people of New South Wales and the people of Australia. Professor John Keane, Associate Professor Robert Smith, Professor Ahmed Shboul and many, many colleagues here from the University of Sydney, distinguished visitors and friends. So it's indeed a very great pleasure to join you all for this official launch of the symposium, Spirited Voices from the Muslim World, Islam, Democracy and Gender Rights. And may I too at this point record my deep respect for the traditional owners of this land upon which we gather here, indeed for all Australia's Indigenous people who've nurtured our great continent for tens of thousands of years. And the warmest of welcomes to all of you who've travelled from afar, from across our land or across the world, visitors from the University of Exeter, from the Free University Berlin, just returned from a few days in Berlin, the National University of Singapore, University Technology Mara in Malaysia, and certainly the great universities of Indonesia, Flinders, La Trobe, Wollongong, closer to home. And certainly we are very proud here to be hosting this very significant symposium. And of course, as indicated in Professor Rahim's words, this is a most timely symposium, and I would like to applaud most strongly and sincerely the organiser and the participants for their vision and wisdom and indeed intellectual courage in bringing forward discussions on issues which may not always be popular in the more conservative environments, but which certainly warrant analysis and progress for the benefit of all peoples of this earth. Already today you've confronted issues relating to the protest movements across the Middle East, secularism and the environment of authoritarian regimes, and the inspirational progress of democracy in Indonesia, our close and highly regarded neighbour. And tonight a truly special presentation awaits us, considerations of one of the most meaningful movements, indeed, in modern civilization, the voice of women. Women, after all, comprise half the world, and as one famous Chinese leader once said, women hold up half the sky. We are indeed privileged to deliver tonight's address, the spirited voices of Muslim women in the Islamic reform movement. Professor Wadud, who of course is a highly regarded scholar, feminist and role model for so many fine women across all cultures. Certainly Our University of Sydney Professor Rahim will introduce her in greater detail. But I want to say, all of you who are gathered here tonight, we will be privileged to hear some very forthright and outspoken ideas on the way forward for so many millions of women of this earth. So it's certainly a privilege and certainly a joy to be the one to declare this symposium open, and certainly my good wishes are with all of you who are participating for a most enriching and memorable meeting, and more to follow in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Professor Marie Bashir. Professor Rodney Smith from the Department of Government and International Relations will now present Her Excellency, Professor Marie Bashir, with a token of our appreciation for launching the symposium.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Oh, thank you all. I don't deserve this. For some of you who may know Bashir is a common name, it is a very common name. And translated, it means the messenger, the person who brings the good tidings. So I'm going to leave it to our speaker to bring you all the good tidings. Thank you.
It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Amina Wadud, who will deliver the keynote address tonight. Professor Wadud arrived only last night after a long flight from South Africa. Actually, it was Johannesburg, Cape Town, Kuala Lumpur, and then Sydney. She arrived last night, and I was amazed. She looked as though she'd just come out of a beauty parlor, a salon, had her hair done. She, I certainly couldn't have done that or looked like that after a long flight. I hope you have, Professor Wadud, recovered from your jet lag. Professor Wadud has long been at the forefront of the gender jihad, the struggle for gender justice within the global Islamic community. Her seminal books, Quran and Women, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective, and Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam, and Once in a Lifetime, and her religious activism have provided the theological and epistemological tools for the struggle to reclaim gender equality in Islam. Professor Wadud's vision for gender equality within an Islamic Tawhidic paradigm incorporates the wider struggle against other forms of oppression, such as racism, bigotry, religious intolerance, economic exploitation, and the general erasure of human dignity. So she reminds us that gender justice does require gender mainstreaming, that is, the inclusion of women in all aspects of Muslim practice, in policy construction, and political and religious leadership. Professor Wadud continues to actively engage with leading Muslim feminist organizations such as Sisters in Islam and Musawa, the global network of Muslim feminists and scholars of Islam. The deep impact and influence of Professor Wadud's writings is clearly evidenced by their diffusion and incorporation into the core curriculum of progressive Muslim civil society organizations and tertiary institutions around the world. Professor Wadud is also the subject of a documentary, The Noble Struggle of Amina Wadud, and has been awarded the Danish Democracy Prize. And I might add, this marvelous documentary is in Fisher Library, so if you're interested in viewing it, it's there. Professor Wadud made international headlines when she delivered a Friday sermon to a mixed-gender congregation of over 100 Muslims in New York City in 2005. While conservative Muslim scholars and clerics charged her with blasphemy, other respected scholars have argued that her actions are supported by Islamic sources and thus entirely orthodox. Professor Wadud is currently a visiting scholar at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California, USA. She has also held positions at Harvard University Divinity School, Virginia Commonwealth University, the International Islamic University in Malaysia, and the University of Melbourne. So distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Amina Wadud.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. I begin as always in the name of God, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. And also I wish to honor the nations, the indigenous people who had this land before we built this new law school building on it. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. I'm going to take advantage of the jet lag to say if I say something that seems very strange, then you just blame it on the jet lag. Otherwise, I intended it, and you can just go with it. And the other thing is that in keeping with the theme of the symposium, the title of my paper, The Voices of Muslim Women in Islamic Reform Movements, called me outside of my area of strength. There's a lot more sort of historical and sociological analysis than I think that I'm very good at. And during the day, when we had our other presentations, there's some very, very smart people here, so I won't embarrass myself by reading the entire paper. It is available, and many of you probably already have it. But the other thing is I wrote a lot more than I could possibly cover in the 45 minutes, and then you'd get bored, and when I got to the part that was really most important to me, you'd be like ready to have jet lag yourself. So I'm gonna kind of run through the beginning to kind of get to that end part with a little bit more timing. But if you don't have a copy of the paper, hopefully my sort of summation at the beginning will still be coherent. And if you have further questions that you want to have me elaborate on some of that, I will certainly do that. And the other thing is, hopefully, you can get a copy of the paper because it is available, and it will probably also be fine-tuned and published later. So anyway, the reason why it is I want to run through the earlier parts is because I'm really very much interested in the theology of Islamic reform movements, not just in terms of the gender jihad, but in terms of other aspects of it. And also because that helps to set the framework for the legitimacy of the jihad for gender justice. And so really it brings our focus once again back to God, remembering, of course, that God is bigger than any discourse and acts in ways not fathomable to human beings at all, and yet is intimately connected to each human being. Even if we choose not to respond to the living presence or reality of the truth or of this living being, I'm not trying to impose this on anybody, but to say something about it as an important location for me. This paper will focus on theology in the debates over women's empowerment in the context of Islam, because we can't say anything about Islam and Muslims or about Muslim women's reform unless we're clear on what we mean by Islam. To discuss the matter of Muslim women, then, we have to interrogate how we use the word Islam. And people use the word Islam all the time to mean many things, and sometimes when they're having a conversation together, they're taking these different meanings which are not congruent with each other, and they're coming into some strife, and it's because they haven't laid the groundwork. They haven't said, on what basis are we operating. And not only that, people use the word Islam in order to be able to assert their authority over certain situations, which you will see will be very important in terms of the gender jihad. But often when people talk about this is Islam, they don't really tell you concretely what the source is. They'll say Islam prohibits homosexuality, or in Islam you must wear the hijab. But without providing these sources, we're pretty much left up to what they say. They say it, therefore it is. And this got problematized, I think, in the modern period when, in my country, particularly in the United States, there's a correlation that's been made between Islam and terrorism. So people realize it's really important to say what you're talking about and where you get the evidence for that. But it's also interesting to note, in fact, it's a little bit confounding to note, that even for people who are working on reform methodology, or action in the communities, the tendency to hark back to a very conservative, what we call a neoconservative definition for Islam, means that some of the progress that we are trying to promote becomes very difficult to achieve unless we think about it in some kind of really radical kind of terms. And so one of the things that's been really important in terms of the gender jihad is for us to own the definition of Islam, for us to interrogate what it means, for us to be able to take agency with regard to how we use Islam. In the Quran, the word Islam is used both with regard to the historical community that started with the time of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also to talk about a posture, a state vis-a-vis all creation, which is conscientious surrender. And the Quran refers to all of nature as Muslim, meaning that it's not just about people, because all of creation is harmonious. It follows a certain order and is balanced between its constituent parts. And that's how we go along our day-to-day basis, sort of on the basis of this kind of Islam. So in order to be able to move forward with reform movements, we have to challenge the notion that Islam is only a set of rules or fatwas that are issued, or even archaic codes that have been permitted. So I'm going to build upon a definition of Islam encapsulated in its most fundamental principle, which is Tawheed. And Tawheed literally is translated as monotheism, but I use it as more than just a reference to God as one. I use it as the basis for all matters of social justice because of it's a second form verb, wahada. It is a little bit more intense than just this kind of just the oneness of God, but it is part of the discourse over pluralism, helping to create a harmony or a unity between the different parts, and mandating a certain kind of relationship between human beings on the basis of their relationship with the ultimate, or with God. Muslim women or women in general in the Quran also have a kind of role that is described on the basis of their very teleological beginnings. The Quran says, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa." Indeed, I will create on the earth an agent. Women are not created as a byproduct of men, as helpmates, as second-class citizens, and her agency is in a direct relationship to God, unmitigated by men, unmitigated by men's agency, and by the family. This agency is to be manifest on the earth, fil ard, that is, in the creation, and therefore standing up for justice and gender equality, working to reform asymmetrical gender relations and policies, toppling tyrannical practices, epistemologies, and governments, are all a part of this divine human relationship of agency, and coincidentally is the same role for men in Islam. So we start with the notion of women as human. And they don't depend on men for their humanity because it was given to them by Allah. As the community of Muslims developed historically, there is, however, a little problem that occurs, and that is that we don't have a record of Muslim women's intellectual, spiritual participation in establishing what becomes the fundamental basis for the understanding and practice of Islam. That doesn't mean that we don't have records of women doing some things. Somebody's coming out with this 40-volume thing, and everybody has been tagging me on Facebook. And then when I read what it says, there's certain things that are still missing, and there's kind of an emphasis on the roles that women did play in the intellectual tradition, but the analysis of these have already been made, and that is that they were primarily engaged in those rote exercises of memorization and transmission. And I'm really interested in this paradigmatic core, how we, over 14 centuries, have developed, an understanding of what is Islam, because I think that that's a part of what the end of the 20th century has shown us is in a really important transformation with regard to women. And also because sometimes in trying to promote gender equality, people will hark back to precedent, like there's no precedent for that. And precedent itself, of course, has a precedent. I mean, it created itself as an authority. And I mean, if you think about it, if in the early days somebody had said to women, well, don't you worry so much about, this ideological development, the sort of intellectual, theological, epistemological, legal, philosophical development. You just, stay at home, take care of the kids. Besides, we like having you there when we come home. But by the way, 14 centuries down the road, we're going to tell you that it was a bad thing that you didn't participate in it. It's going to prove that you were weak. And not only that, if you speak out against it at that time, we're going to tell you that you're wrong, and that your voice is awra, and you shouldn't be in the public space at all. And so it's a really funny kind of thing that precedent has so much authority, but precedent itself is built upon precedent. And so what we're doing today as Muslim women is taking the responsibility to help establish new canon, to construct new traditions, to form new policies, living in the present with an eye on the past and a directive towards the future. This is a corrective to the asymmetry between women and men in the Muslim community. Now, there's always been the existence of voices in objection to the dominance of the patriarchal perspective on Islam. But these have usually been isolated voices or individuals. So really what I want to talk about is the Muslim women's movement in modernity as a movement that is at the masses level. There are more women participating in the movement today than there ever was at any other time in history, both by percentage and by actual number. And that's what makes this such an exciting time to be active and engaged in it. Of course, that doesn't mean that they all are approaching it with the same agenda, the same perspective, the same methodology. And so what I want to look at are three major perspectives on gender reform. And I'm going to look at two of them to confirm my limited knowledge, but I like the way Her Excellency said that she got her degree here 55 years ago. I feel a little bit better by saying I've been engaged in the gender jihad for more than 4 decades. There was a time in my life when I actually could say, I don't think I'm going to see what I'm looking for before I die. And although I think that that may be true in the big sense, in another sense, I have seen the beginnings of some things that really make me, I'm sorry, just to think about it, that really are very moving in my lifetime. And there was some of it that I thought I would not even see the beginnings of. So I'm going to not do service to all of the perspectives as much as to the last one that I'm going to introduce. And also I want you to think about the Muslim women's movement in the global context. In fact, think about Islam in the global context. And because it's very difficult for us at this present time in history not to sustain a kind of global awareness. And that global awareness was very instrumental for the beginnings of the mass movements of Muslim women, because there was a transition going on between colonial rule and the beginnings of and the establishment of the nation state. And there are problems with the nation state, yes, and I'm not trying to say, that it is some ideal, but it is in fact the outstanding reality of today. And for the beginnings of the Muslim women's movement, actually Muslim women in countries with a Muslim majority were a part of the national struggle for independence from colonialism, which is another major global phenomenon affecting the reform realities of the women's movement. When women participated, I'm sure, had expectation that they would also be beneficiaries of the reform movements that they were participating in. But what actually happened, as research has shown, is that when the movement ended and the beginnings of these national identities were being shaped, women's concerns were often relegated to the background or totally ignored, if not simply pushed aside. And so in this, it was necessary for women to awake, and the tendency of women's organizations or organizational structures to be linked to larger male organizations for independence from colonialism separated into women having their own organizations to deal with issues related to their relationship to the public space, politics, social, economics, and legal rights. So in the 19th century, when women and men engaged in this, what I call new kind of global awareness, there was a thing that I think is crucial in terms of the interfacing between these three major voices, and that is you have to recognize that although you come from your own locality, and that there are certain national realities in this phenomena of the nation state, that your day-to-day life is part of a continuum, first of all, of time. There was a way of living before that may not be the same as now, and there is this potential way of living for the future. But also that your realities, your worldview, your perspective, your religion, your nationality, your language, your whatever, is a part of a much more dynamic global reality. And so the sense of pluralism, the way we talk about it today, is crucial. We are required to accept not only our perspective and our experiences, but also the perspective, the experiences, and the ways of life of people who are very different from us and may never be like us. And that's how we live in the world, in the global context in which we are today. So the first women who were engaged were also women who were privileged by status, by class, tended to be better educated and often world-traveled. And they also saw for themselves that the world is not uniform, and it was possible for them to think about women's participation outside of the clustered environment of the home. And they began to stand up for changes in their cultures and in their communities. So the identity for Muslim women during these transitional times was also being changed from just a member of a family to a citizen, a member of a nation state. And sometimes when we think about the women's movement, we don't think about it in that framework, but it's very hard to run a nation state if that nation state has different identities. Okay, women will get this one, blacks will get this one, and then somebody else will get something else. It's very hard, and that's why a lot of the movements of reform with regard to minorities for all of the issues that I'm interested in was really important for women to claim a part in it at the beginning. But it was also necessary that people have a vision outside of their own locality in order to be able to think about sometimes a different way of living from the way that they had been living. And that was true in terms of gender reform. So Margot Badran refers to this as the first wave of Islamic feminism or Muslim feminism or gender reformist. The three movements that I'm talking about now evolved from that time with distinctions, but at the same time we can kind of all hark back to that as the origins of our development. But what happened as the nation state pushed forward is a contention between some of the perspectives. And one of the contentions had to do with the value, the necessity, or the lack of necessity for religion as part of the identity at all. Especially considering that in the middle of the 20th century, and you have to think about this because at the beginning of the 20th century this wasn't so, but at the middle of the 20th century, the idea of a united nation began, and the distribution, which has gone on for quite some time, of international instruments talking about human rights. The notion of human rights took shape in relationship to the rest of the world and had an effect on the rest of the world, for good or for ill, and is an effort that it goes on. I mean, the idea that we started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and now we're into, indigenous rights, and we're into children's rights, and et cetera, means that it's at least an intentional projection on this universal notion of human being, but it's become complicated because we are complicated as human beings, and that's okay. But as far as the Islamic debates go in terms of gender, the existence of these documents and the perspectives that they offer became a key point for the evolution of the two strongest voices with regard to gender reform. One which I refer to as secular Muslim feminist, and the other which is the Islamist. Now, these two, by the way, shaped the discourse on each other in ways that's very interesting. The secularist outlook, and I'm quoting here from actually an Islamist leader, is basically one that starts by marginalizing God, or sometimes even announcing his death, placing the human at the center of the universe as its logo. So through gradual stages, the Muslim secularist agenda was born, and unfortunately for us, the term secular took on, I think, the sort of French laïcité version of it, which is the antithesis of religion, not just the separation between government and religion for the sake of development. But in the context of people freeing themselves from colonialism, there really was a certain kind of hegemonic imperialism that got shifted in with them, and so there was a rejection of this in order to come to their own national identity. And this is true in places like South America and other parts of Asia and Africa, whether they be Muslim or not. So of course, it happened in the Muslim context, and it affected the debates on Islam and gender. So the Muslim feminist articulation moved forward, sort of walking hand in hand with the promotions of the international documents, the universalization of human rights, and the Islamist agenda took off because of a fundamental and I think a heartfelt sense at which Islam is the solution. And all we need to do is to go back to the glory of Islam, and everything is going to be all right. And the merit of this return to Islam is both authentic and authoritative. So other worldviews will be attacked as being foreign, Western and the like, and counterproductive to Muslim social order. And sometimes they will be also considered as being un-Islamic. And this thrust, this Islamist thrust, had as its high point, I think, the Iranian Revolution, because it showed that somehow rallying behind Islam, you really could overturn a government. But there are certain problems with the Islamist articulation. One of them being that it is often focusing on the return to Sharia, the establishment of Sharia. And let me just say a little bit about Sharia, because it's important to kind of also put that in perspective. First of all, there was no Sharia at the time of the Prophet. He didn't establish any legal schools. The term is not even used in the Quran in the way in which we use it now. It does talk about Shar Allah. What is being called back to in the context of the Islamist agenda is really fiqh. And fiqh is the human effort to understand what is Sharia, and Sharia is actually a transcendent kind of term, or a term relating to a transcendent kind of reality, which is the ideal or perfect state, and a state of relationship to God. The meaning of the word is actually a path that leads to water, water being the source of all life. So Sharia, in that sense, is the ideal. But the actual way in which it's implemented is fiqh. And fiqh is also not singular. There are the various schools, the 5 major Islamic schools of thought, the major Shia Islamic school of thought. So we can't even speak of a coherent sense of what is Islamic law, but rather what are Islamic laws. And what the Islamist movement is trying to do now is bring that into the purview of the nation state. But the problem is eventually whose Sharia, and not only whose Sharia in terms of how it's going to be defined, but also who will have the power to enforce their understanding of this, holistic Sharia or way or sacred evolution. Abdullahi an-Na'im, whose work has already been referred to earlier today in the symposium, says, Sharia principles cannot be enacted and enforced by the state as public law and public policy solely on the grounds that it is believed to be part of Sharia. If such enactment and enforcement is attempted, the outcome will necessarily be the political will of the state and not the Islamic law of Islam. The fact that ruling elites sometimes make claims to legitimize their control of the state in the name of Islam does not make such claims true. Now, this reductionist perspective with regard to returning to Sharia is critical for women and women's reforms, because what is usually meant here is a return to archaic forms of Muslim personal law or Muslim status law. And Muslim personal law was developed completely on the basis of the patriarchal extended family. And in the patriarchal family, the man is given preference over the woman and also given access to her life, her sexuality, and there's not a lot of choices for women under this model, and in the past, their acquiescence to it was actually a part of acquiescence of being a part of the community because there were no other alternatives. And the marriage contract itself is not a reciprocal contract, it's actually a relationship of sales. What's being sold is actually access to a woman's sexual organs. And when we start talking about family values, and about Islamic law, we really have to roll back what we mean by these words and what are the consequences for women, because when you look at the real families, you find something very far from the ideal. Of course, now when you find something far from the ideal, it's going to often be the woman's fault, or the Islamists will say, well, that these are really un-Islamic families, and that's why they're having a problem. So it's a kind of cyclical thing. You're not really going to get out of the spiral. Also in the Islamist movement, there's a very interesting kind of phenomena, and that is that For Muslim women in the Islamist movement, there is a presentation of a model that actually itself has no historical precedent. And that is women having a certain role in the public space while simultaneously supporting and staying silent about their relationship in the private space. It's a kind of odd kind of thing. And so that's one reason why things like the hijab is become very central in terms of a symbol of the Islamic movement, because they're not asking for total reform. And so in order to symbolize at once an acquiescence to this traditional family structure, patriarchal structure, and their involvement in the public space, they have to wear, hijab, and the longer the better, because without it, you're not really representative. Now, it doesn't mean that all women wear hijab for that same reason. People do it for cultural reasons, people do it in terms of their own religious predilections, but there is something particular in the symbolism of the hijab or the scarf in terms of the Islamist movement. So, Maryami, who is a Muslim feminist scholar, says that culturalist Islamism assumes a dead culture, a culture impenetrable to other cultures, to historical development, and unchangeable over time, that bears no resemblance to the stunning diversity of social reality. So our reality is actually quite diverse, but the Islamist agenda wants to be able to synthesize everything down to sort of black and white, do's and don'ts. Have you ever seen that book called The Halal wa Haram fil Islam, the prohibited and the permissible in Islam? It's like about 130 pages, as if you can actually take all that's permissible or prohibited in Islam and put it into 130 pages. But all of this online fatwas and stuff, they're based on that same principle, that there's a clear black and there's a clear white, and what you have to do is separate those two and you'll have a perfect life, and you'll go to heaven. So in 1995, I went to the World Conference for Women in Beijing. And the Muslim women who were present attempted to have a meeting. I think the goal was to form a caucus. But these two sides, the Muslim secular feminists and the Islamists, were fighting so hard that you could not come to any kind of consensus over what was the thrust, where were we going. But what was also interesting is that the seeds for an alternative were already present. And that alternative, and I think the issue comes down to this. After the development of things like CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, how to reform the lives of Muslim women to help promote their well-being, which I think really is the greater goal, got sided off into these two camps. And it comes down to a question of human rights and Islam. And the two things cannot coexist. You either have human rights or you have Islam. And for the Muslim secularists, if there's a problem, you get rid of the religion and you go to the human rights instruments and et cetera. And for the Islamists, if there's a problem, obviously you're going to get rid of the human rights because it's a Western invention and blah, 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 and we have our own way in Islam. When we were at the Beijing conference, and I myself, was very conflicted by this kind of thing, we said, why does it have to be either or? I mean, how do we develop an articulation that is both and, both human rights and Islam? And that's what we began working on. For one thing, most Muslim women unquestionably identify with Islam. Now, that doesn't mean that at the same time they don't also express concerns over real experiences of the disjuncture between what is labeled as the ideal of Islam and what they are experiencing in their own realities. In the 20th century, these lived realities were beginning to be increasingly made public. And with all this attention that was being drawn to it, it put a bad light on Islam. So for some women, it was okay to disavow Islam. And for the Islamists, there was kind of a wisdom underlying this, and so we just had to sort of figure it out. But for people like me, I used to call myself at that time pro-faith, pro-feminist. I was trying to capture both and, but as yet there was no such thing as Islamic feminism. The rise of, okay, I'm going to skip over that, just a little bit more about the rise of Islamism and the challenges to secular feminism, and I'm going to move a little bit ahead to, there's no doubt that women's roles in Islam are part of the current global debates. More importantly, as I said, unlike any other time in history, Muslim women themselves are leading these debates. I am looking at the difference between these three main voices and reminding you that, of course, there are nuances between them. However, it is undeniable that Muslim women themselves are taking control over the future of what Islam and gender will look like. At stake is the fundamental understanding of what Islam intends for women, notions of gender from, at stake is what Islam intends for women as human beings and agents of Allah, as well as citizens in a global context. As Muslim women, notions of gender still linger in their kind of pre-modern formulations, and that is untenable. However, the ability to counter such ideas by formulating new ones has gained momentum within an Islamic framework with the kind of work that is being done under the banner of Islamic feminism, and this is the third voice. Islamic feminism works to establish a new egalitarian epistemology of Islam based on its own primary sources and not with the intermediary of patriarchal thinking or thinkers. Islamic feminism says, Islam belongs to all of us. All of us have a stake, not only in how our religion is defined, but also in how religious ideas are implemented into policy and in our homes. Furthermore, we say notions about women's subservience are the result of certain medieval constructions reflecting the understanding of jurists and philosophers at that time, but they are not divine constructions. We are free to understand divine constructions for ourselves and in our context. When we do this, we unveil a much broader vista of gender possibilities than heretofore practiced or imagined. In our context, as creatures created by Allah, notions of justice, that essential principle inherent in all Islamic texts, must be in accordance to our lived reality. For the medieval jurists, justice for women was viewed as a kind of guardianship. Women needed to be protected. Quote, the selected historical fiqh to meet the social justice needs for women remains within the traditional pre-modern framework. Justice is perceived as a kind of kindness to women as wards of male guardians. The reforms retaining the wide authority of males over females and the ensuing laws which mirror the pre-modern fiqh are enacted to give women an unprecedented respect and protection in the patriarchal context. And that's from a friend of mine and the lawyer, Salbia Ahmed. She says, I am not suggesting that there is a conspiracy amongst the classical jurists to undermine women or that they deliberately sought to ignore the voices of revelation or wahi. Rather, I argue that in their understanding of sacred texts, these jurists were guided by their outlook, and in discerning the terms of the Sharia, they were constrained by a set of legal and gender assumptions and theories that reflected the state of knowledge and normative values of their time. These theories, which are the product of either juristic speculation or social norms, continued to be treated by subsequent generations of jurists as though they were immutable. And that's also from Salbia Ahmed. Today, we are up against the realization about diverse communities and diversity within communities, as well as by modes of operation beyond those into which we were born and about which we know of radically alternative worldviews and epistemologies. We are also up against attempts to articulate universal ideas about humans and about human rights. The possibility of participating in these discussions as Muslims actually stems from the kind of work that's being done to help shape a new Islamic feminist philosophy and theology. This is based on an interactive relationship with the production of knowledge in Islam, including knowledge about God or Allah, and knowledge about human relations in relation to Allah and in relation to each other. The basis of this philosophical perspective is Tawheed. However, Tawheed, as it operates on the metaphysical level, is not limited to Islam and Muslims. It is simply derived from Islamic sources. At its root of Tawheed is monotheism. However, it is more than merely God or Allah is one, especially considering that the origins of the word Tawheed is the second form of the verb, which is emphatic. That makes it more dynamic than simple numerology. God's oneness has three dimensions. God is unique, unlike anything in creation, therefore above gender, not limited to being itself a he or a she. And God is united. All 99 attributes of God adheres in its oneness without distinction or even contradiction. But most importantly, God unites. It is this latter aspect that leads to an explicit result in interhuman relations. At the metaphysical level, God is the highest and ultimate reality, and this will be depicted in sort of a vertical line that goes sort of up and down. But human beings, as creatures created by Allah and as servants, are below that level on the material plane. And because each has a direct relationship with Allah, can only have a relationship with each other of horizontal reciprocity. We are equal. We are mirrors of each other in our belief in the sublime and majestic oneness of Allah. This Tawhidic paradigm of reciprocity moves beyond its philosophical and theological framework when put into application in civil society in the context of global pluralism. No one has greater humanity than any other. The means for working out that humanity in civil society have been most developed under the new democracies, although here too, I would not say they are perfect. They simply adhere to the necessity of people to orchestrate the rules of their own realities. For women and gender, and especially in the context of Islam and Muslims, this also requires a fundamental rethinking of family and restructuring of Muslim personal status laws. All aspects of family that existed before, which have their patriarchal manifestations, need to be challenged, and those that did not can move forward. Marriage becomes then not a contract of sales, where woman is a commodity to man, which is the Kiwama model, but marriage, in fact, is a contract of exchange. Both partners become entwined with the other through mutual commitment, fidelity, responsibility, and love. The difference between them biologically will certainly affect the childbearing and child-rearing stages, but only in so much as the biological tasks go. No other aspects of nurturing, developing, well-being, and caretaking is limited to biology. This is the Muwaddatan wa Rahma model. In the broader context of policy, politics, public rituals, and the home, no role is exclusive to either male or female. The capacity to develop skills mandated to fulfill any role adheres only to our humanness and not to our biological sex. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wadud, for that most inspiring address. We now have about 30 minutes or so for questions from the floor. So please identify yourself when asking a question, and we'll take about 3 questions or so at a time.
our region would definitely benefit from knowing more about this movement, as it seems to be a rather effective manifestation of Islamic feminism. So if you can please elaborate on that. And also, I'd like to hear your opinion on how we can extend the reformist agenda to cover LGBT Muslims and how they can be included within this new paradigm.
Could you please identify yourselves?
My name is Chandran, and I'm actually a retired academic professor. My question is about the issue of marriage and divorce in Islam and the seemingly unequalness in this between a man and a woman. For example, a man, as I understand, is allowed polygamy, whereas a woman is not. And similar unequalness exists even in divorce. Is this just something that came about as a wrong precedent, or is there some wrong interpretation coming from the holy books? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps you'd like to respond
Start
to
with
the
those
two.
two?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, the answers are kind of connected. Musawa, and actually for those people who are like really interested in looking into it, online, the word Musawa, MUSAWAH.org, and you can actually go to the website and start to see how this is evolving. And Musawa is a movement, it's not an organization. Its origins is not in Malaysia. Its origins is actually in a collective of women and men who have been engaged in gender reforms in Islam for some time. And on the website, for example, you'll see country reports from over 40 countries indicating the ways in which they have been dealing directly with the law in the context of Muslim personal law and Muslim family law to achieve equality. And the difference between Musawa and everything that happened before was that the family was relegated to the private space, and everything in the public space had to be adjudicated for this new nation-state development. So unequal relations in the family got to be retained. And this is true even among Muslim secular feminists, because the focus was on the public space and on things like governance and education and economics. And then, the family was, just leave the family the way the family is. And of course, in the Islamist agenda, the family is based on a principle of equity, because we can't have equality. So the main thrust of the distinction in terms of the Musawa movement from movements that were happening before is this articulation of equality. The basis of that equality is actually on the Tawhidic paradigm, which, I was supposed to have a PowerPoint, but I'm shifting to the iPad, and it doesn't have a jump drive capability, and it doesn't have a PowerPoint, so it's not possible for me to keep them, things generated when I'm traveling, so, I didn't have one available. But this same Tawhidic paradigm I use in terms of working as an ally to the LGBTQ community. In fact, in South Africa, I was at a retreat, an international retreat for Muslim lesbians and gays, bisexual, transgendered, and intergendered people. And the basis of working on that is establishing a relationship between each person and Allah in the context of Islam. That means that between yourself and another person, there can only be equality. So anything that looks like discrimination or oppression is rooted out, and that's how it's connected. One of the things that it's kind of hard to get all of the details, in my paper, and I did sort of skip around, but one of the ways in which the movement is proceeding forward is when we take agency with regard to the definition of Islam, it means that we take agency with regard to not only textual interpretation, but also textual application. How is the application used? So yes, in the Quran, there is permission for a man to take up to 4 wives. But what's interesting about it is that in the Quran, the one verse that starts this discussion, and it actually gives the numbers 1, 2, 3, or 4, has the word justice in 3 different places. If you feel you will not deal justly, blah, 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 and do it with justice, and that's word justice. So what has happened is, under the incentive of this taking agency with regard to definition of Islam, is you must bring evidence to support a practice as sustaining the justice that is the underlying intention of all the literature that's developed on Islam and of the Quran itself. It's called the maqasid. You know, the goal of the law, the goal of the Quran is justice. If you have evidence to the contrary, then that evidence says that the practice itself is illegitimate and needs to be curtailed or stopped or something. So in the case of Malaysia, for example, they've done a thorough research over a period of a couple years with families engaged in the practices of polygyny to show, you know, the good and the bad. So it means that if you have evidence that you can show that it's not a good practice, then that evidence becomes the foundations of being able to advocate against it and to also establish policies that will curtail it. So in other words, just because polygyny was practiced and the Quran refers to that practice doesn't mean we have to continue to practice if it is not good. And the same thing I would say with regard to slavery. There's slavery in the Quran and we have decided, you know, universally that it's not good. We're doing the same thing with regard to other practices. And the same thing is true with divorce, although you skipped over it, you know, kind of quickly. But the only distinction that you find in the Quran with regard to divorce is that the Quran explicitly talks about the right that a husband has to repudiate marriage, that is to, you know, move towards divorce. But again, the question is that an articulation of a practice as it existed or a recommendation for all times and all places? And what has happened in terms of the real practice of divorce, which of course is one of the most difficult things that anybody has to go through, no matter what your religion or absence of religion, and what's happened in terms of actually looking at divorce practices across the world, which of course has been also product of a lot of research, I mean the subject of a lot of research, is that if a man practices unilateral repudiation, talaq, where he has the power only in his hands, there have been an extensive amount of mismanagement results. So for example, Tuesday, I'm the man. Tuesday, I don't like you, you're the woman, and I say I divorce you. And then I go off and I hang out with my friends at the club, and on Friday night I come back and I'm horny, and you've decided you're gonna go forward with it, and you're gonna go and marry somebody else. Well, I'm gonna take you to court and say you've done something wrong. So I'm making this short story and kind of making a joke of it, but that's what really happens. And because of it, one of the things that women have been working on, and there's not a consensus on this because in certain parts of the African continent it's anti-productive, is that a man cannot make his repudiation without going to the court to register it. So then it becomes a matter of the court. And when it becomes a matter of the court, it is also going to be subject to court supervision. So basically, he doesn't have a unilateral right. And the other thing, which is just my working on textual analysis all the time, the other thing is that in no way does it actually say that women don't have this right. It simply was not mentioned in the text. So the possibility for women to also have the right to be able to pronounce divorce now has to be encoded into the marriage contract. Remember what I was saying about this marriage contract. The terms of it need to be articulated: her right to work, her right to travel, and her right for divorce. And so there are means at which we are working with, you know, the Quran came at a time and a place, and there were certain things at that time and place which are not universal. That's established. But what's happening with regard to gender is that we keep wanting to pull back, and if you had something that you wanted to do that had with sort of economic freedom in the world monetary order or something, they're moving forward because we got all that oil and we want to make sure we get the maximum amount from it. So what we're trying to do in this process of dynamic relationship to our laws and our text and our Lord and each other is to interrogate the underlying assumptions and to indicate ways in which the overarching principles of love and mercy in the partnership will be sustained, and to challenge those things that actually are proven to create some type of hegemony and discord. So marriage and divorce obviously are pretty high up on that list of things we're looking at.
Yes. Please identify yourself.
You might want to stand because the people in the back won't hear you, although I will, and I'm really not good at repeating questions, trying to take notes at the same time. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Wadud, for the address tonight. Yes, I'm a government student here at Sydney University, and I was just curious about the context of global pluralism, I think is how you put it in the address a couple of times tonight. And given that context, what role do you see for thinking about the future of Islamic feminism in a nation-state context? Is there a place for thinking about nation-states when thinking about Islamic feminism?
Yes, Charlotte.
I'm going to ask you a question that I think you've heard a million times before, but I'm very curious about your response, which is the classic question that feminism has to face, which is the question of difference. As you know, feminism has gone through all these stages, with the first generation of feminism that was largely about extending political participation, but this basic biological difference was not necessarily something that was questioned, to more radical forms of feminism that basically have decided that that difference is something that is merely biological and should not be significant politically, which is something that you sort of hinted at the end. But I was wondering what were your sort of textually inspired views, or what is Islam's position? How to deal with that difference between men and women? How big a space should it occupy? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Wadud. I'm Ida Lichter, and I am a writer on Muslim women's reform. I wonder if you could give us some idea on how powerful the movement is amongst Muslim women reformers, and also what efforts are being made to co-opt men in the reform movement.
Okay, let's see what the first question was. The context of global pluralism and the role of Islamic feminism in the nation state. One of the things that you have to understand, I think, fundamentally, is that if there was no inequality between women and men, there wouldn't be a need for a feminist movement. So feminism is based on the radical notion that women are human beings. And any practice or belief system that challenges that becomes subject to a need for reform. So if the nation state achieved its objective, which again, it's a construct, and I think that there are problems with the construct, but for the moment it is the one that we have. If the nation state achieved its objective, then there would not be women and men, there would be citizens. And citizens will be given equal rights. So in the context of the nation state, then ideally, there's no need for any kind of feminism. But in reality, we actually do. And in particular, Islamic feminism is, and I think this also gets into a little bit of your question about one of the aspects of the development of feminism in general. Islamic feminism is taking the history of the evolution of feminism. Now, let me just say, because for years I never would identify myself as a feminist, one, because I'm African American and it did not articulate my reality sufficiently as an African American woman. I come from a poor background, it didn't articulate class matters sufficiently. It was very much a white middle class women thing, but that was true also in terms of the beginning of the Muslim women's movement. It was basically upper class and that kind of thing. So what Islamic feminism is doing actually is challenging the meaning of feminism and challenging the meaning of Islam so that there can be a cooperation between the two terms. Muslim secular feminists were able to coincide with the thrust of the sort of mainstream feminist movement because the matter of religion was not yet crucial in terms of Western feminism. That has also changed, and women from various faiths that dominate in the Western world have also engaged in considering the relationship between feminism and religion in general, and feminism and certain patriarchal religious structures in particular. And so feminism is multifaceted, and the necessity for being able to keep that multifaceted aspect of it is necessary when we think about its wedding with the term Islamic. Because Islamic feminism also confers the notion of the existence of basic biological distinctions. But as I said here, that biology does not become the basis for determining the roles either in family or in the public space or in ritual performance, because I have to say that because sometimes people forget that rituals happen both in private and in the public space. So moving to acknowledge difference is one thing, but using difference, as you said, politically or as the basis for being able to limit someone's participation at any level is another thing. So obviously Islamic feminism would challenge rules that say in Saudi Arabia that you can't drive because you're a woman. We definitely know it's not Islamic, so I don't know why that part even should be questioned, but it's a dynamic. In other words, every aspect is not fixed, but acknowledging and confirming the reality of women's reproduction roles, or not roles, let me not use that word, women's reproductive capacity, which is also an issue in terms of all of the human rights discussion. Acknowledging and confirming that means that under certain circumstances, you have to take that into consideration, and the rulings may be different. The persons are different, but the rulings are different. We call this the substantive model of equality, and probably the best way to think about it is working on issues with people who have physical challenges. We don't call them disabilities, physical challenges. How do you make sure that a person who is wheelchair bound has equal access to this lecture hall? Okay? Now, in my country, we have rules. And the rule says if you have a room, it must be both accessible for entry and exit of any student at the university, despite what their abilities are to go up the stairs. So the active participation in correctives in the ways in which laws have been established has been part of the feminist agenda, and also would be part of the Islamic feminist agenda, in the context of the nation state. And the other thing is that accepting that there are biological differences, which for the most part there are, and not being limited by those distinctions is not the same thing as trying to eradicate it. And so I'm personally not in favor of the idea that equality has something to do with sameness. And the reason why I'm not in favor of the idea in my context, that is as a Muslim woman working on gender issues in Islam, is that men who use this basically use it in order to say women will never be equal to men because they're different, but they never say it with regard to all the vast differences between them. So diversity becomes crucial to acknowledge that we don't need to be the same in order to be equal. And so it's a much more dynamic engagement in such a way that people's real circumstances have to be taken into consideration before you adjudicate. That's the legal part of it. Before you adjudicate on the ways in which to handle certain situations. And this goes into effect because my brother here mentioned something about marriage and divorce, but there's an interesting situation with regard to how inheritance laws are structured in the context of Islam with regard to gender divide. So it's interesting because you, at one and the same time, must take into consideration biological distinctions, but at the same time not be inhibited to just that to determine what the outcomes will be. As far as the co-opting of men in terms of the Islamic feminist movement, there hasn't been a problem, except there's two things that I kind of want to say in relationship to it. The vested interest that women have in gender equality is really coherent, it's really clear. And therefore, we are inhabited by more women than men in that struggle. But there has never been the idea of the exclusion of men, except, and this is important to understand, except that in certain circumstances, women need the company of other women in order to develop. And in that case, then we accept men to work on the cause of gender reform as allies. In other words, the need to be able, and this was found out in terms of like the consciousness raising movements that happen in the context of sort of general feminist movement. And there are situations where women need to be working with women, for women, about women. But that's not the only situation. And the problem often in trying to include men, which we do, in other words, we don't necessarily say there's an absolute exclusion. But the problem in terms of being able to include them is that often they come in order to be able to, one, take over, and two, to be able to assert that they, again, have done us some great service. Now, it's really important to understand equality, human rights, human dignity, all of these things were given to me by God. It's not given to me by any men. But I am very happy to work with anybody, including people who don't have a gender. I met the most interesting intersex person at this retreat that I was just in. So it's not a question of what gender you are in order to be able to participate in the movement for equality. But we have a history that we have to acknowledge in order to move forward from it. And unfortunately, the history in the context of Islam and gender is a history where women's participation has continued to be marginalized, and we have a lot of catching up to do. So men are welcome to work on the cause in every way that they can possibly think of, but they may not always have access to women's spaces where they're working on the issues amongst themselves. And that's something that, doesn't mean that we don't also network. In other words, we create spaces where women and men are working together. But for me, in terms of public discourse, it's important to be able to, and I often say, women and men, the Islamic feminist movement is not restricted to just women, but it is about women, it is for women. And it's also about women being able to take full agency in circumstances that have been denied them historically without feeling that somehow they've gone outside of Islam or outside of their family or even outside of their own femininity. And in order to create that space, there's like a lot of work that we have to do, and sometimes that work excludes the comfort zone that would be available if we have men that are also in that space. So that's not saying anything about not having them. It's saying that there are terms, and unfortunately the terms are based on the oppression that we've experienced in terms of reaching equality in the first place.
Thank you very much. I have one question. What is your intention when you lead Friday prayer in 2005? Well, I think it's very controversial issue and a very sensitive issue in Muslim world. And maybe you can give the theological argument behind what is your action. Because for many Islamic feminists, like in Indonesia, it is very counterproductive because, oh, you are the Amina Wadud follower, so don't follow him, don't follow her, something like that. So it's like will deny the other struggle, like the other gender equality issues. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, when the role in public ritual is distinguished from the role of women's equality movement, then you're going to have that and people are going to believe that. But actually, under the Tawhidic paradigm, no role is exclusive by gender. There may be a role that's exclusive by biology, but there's no role that's exclusive by gender. So that is my basis. However, the discussion has gone into many dimensions. It would be a whole nother lecture to talk about all the dimensions. But for me personally, it was coming to understand Tawhid, and then also the necessity, which I did hint at in my paper, for taking a theological perspective of a direct relationship with God, which means only a relationship of equality with others, including others of another gender. Taking that into practice means that I had to go into arenas that heretofore had not been gone into. So my goal with it was twofold. One, to worship Allah, which is my goal every time I pray. And second, to affirm in practice what I believe with regard to equality of persons. So it's much easier for me to pray by myself or to not take the responsibility of leading the prayer, because then somebody else has that responsibility. But if I take responsibility for it, then I affirm what I say that I believe in terms of equality. And eventually, and this is what's slowly happening, eventually it will become normative. It will not be a special Amina Wadud act, which, yeah, that's a, no, you're being like Amina Wadud, you have to, I'm running around this balloon, Amina Wadud. It will be accepted as a normative act in every situation where somebody it could be a woman or a man leading prayer, because it's normal. And that we haven't gotten to, but it is becoming more commonplace, which is interesting. So eventually we won't look up and say, oh, that Amina Wadud thing.
One last question. Yes,
The question is, you've been talking about the God-given right for everyone, and I would just wonder, because many of those laws, many of those rules, like for example marriage, and many of those have been used by many scholars to be written in the Quran, or being the Quran the source of it. I just wonder what is your position in regard to that, because it seems to be established that inequality somehow already written. I just wonder your interpretations about it, and what is your position in regard to that?
Okay, did he identify himself? Carlos. Well, there's two things. Clearly, you haven't read my first book, which is called Quran and Woman. If I had known what I know now, I would have called it Quran and Gender, because actually there are no rules of inequality established in the Quran. There's only the interpretation or application of that interpretation that ends up establishing rules. The Quran has less than 100 statements that are actually about rules. Out of 6,000 verses, only about 100 that are about rules. And maybe like closer to 300 that are kind of relative to the making of rules. But when I talked about the distinction between Sharia as a divine order or ideal, and fiqh, which is the human understanding of that order, you're now back into the territory of fiqh, and you're blaming it on the Quran. So the second thing, clearly you have not read the Quran, because there's no rule that you can come from the Quran and say that means you're unequal.
My question was more focused about how do they use that against it? I'm not saying that this interpretation that some people might use that as a. I definitely understand your position, and I wasn't using in a way to offend anyway. I was trying to just understand how some people might use that against, because I definitely think that you're an inspiration for any single minority or women, gender, anything, struggle for equality. So that's what I'm saying, that how can we get to those people and make them understand that exactly how you explained me, because it's very difficult. Sometimes some people are very narrow-minded, and it's very difficult to explain them that difference that you actually just mentioned to me, which I definitely believe is totally.
Okay, so based on what I think I'm hearing in your second articulation of it, how do we get to people who basically say that inequality extends from the Quran, and that has actually been why it is that Islamic feminism have come into a clearer articulation today, because it's based on taking responsibility for the interpretation of the religious sources, and taking agency for it, that is owning it. The text is not something out there. And many women who work as activists in the community are not religious scholars, in fact, don't have the time to be religious scholars. And so in working with the community, especially working with activist organizations, women and men, one of the things that I actually start doing is to unpack the tendency that some people have to say, well, you can't do that because that's Islam, or even if they say you can't do that because it's against the Quran. And that is, as I tried to say with you, be specific. If you can show me a place that says this, then we can address it. And often it is just an assumption. And the assumption that the Quran promotes inequality between women is something that I literally worked on 20 years ago. And it's not a one-step thing, but it is possible to be able to use it. And since that's been more than 20 years and we're still working on it, we have to keep using it. In other words, we have to dismantle the tendency to attach authority randomly to our religion, to our prophet, to the Quran, or to Allah, without people also bringing their evidence to support it. And most of the time, they don't have the evidence. They simply have the power of intimidation.
Well, The normative act at Sydney University is to present our keynote speaker with a token of our appreciation. Professor Rodney Smith from the Department of Government will do this normative act. So thank you, Professor Wadud, for a most inspiring presentation. Thank you, Her Excellency, Professor Marie Bashir, for launching the symposium. There are some light refreshments outside, so please join us in having these refreshments. Thank you very much.